Welcome to the launch of the ReVista issue on religion and spirituality. This conference is being recorded. At the end of the presentations by group leaders, which are based on the discussions people just had at a private session about the issue, we will open it up for questions from the other panelists and from the audience in general. The chat has been disabled except for information, and so you will go to the Q&A at the bottom of your screen for any questions that you have. You may put them in at any time when people are talking or at the end of the session. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator, David Carrasco, whom to many of you needs no introduction. He is the Neil Rudenstein Professor of Latin American Studies with a joint appointment at the Divinity School and the Anthropology Department. He is also the brains behind this issue and has really helped to bring it together and to shepherd it into the world. David.
So June Ehrlich is a characteristically very generous colleague. And really this is this meeting, this issue, and the many years of tremendous journalism through ReVista is really the creation and the work of June Ehrlich. And I've been asked almost a handful of times to participate in ReVista, and each time it's lifted my game. And I found June to be a very helpful editor. Those of you who are aspiring writers, let me just tell you a quick story, because it's to produce something like ReVista, it doesn't just come because people write good articles. You have to have good editors. And if you don't understand that you have to undergo the pain of being edited, you'll never be a good writer. I had the opportunity some years ago to accompany Toni Morrison to Mexico City. And she wanted to meet Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And so I helped arrange this meeting at the home of Carlos Fuentes. And as the evening wore on, being there with Carlos Fuentes and Garcia Marquez and Toni Morrison, you know, it was really something out of this world. I thought it was totally magical realism myself. And at the height of the evening, Garcia Marquez and Toni Morrison stood in the middle of the living room and started to talk about their experiences as writers. And it just really taught me a lot, because both of them said that they had to have good editors. And if you didn't have a good editor, you couldn't become a good writer. So here's Garcia Marquez telling us that the best editors are the ones who work at this press. And here's Toni Morrison said, oh yes, I absolutely depended on these good editors. Well, let me tell you, June Ehrlich is such a good editor. And she's not only edited me, but all of you have had the opportunity to be edited by her. And that's how we got to today. So all of this is really June Ehrlich editing us. And the issue, I think, is outstanding. I've had a chance to read the different articles. I can see the combination of lived experience, theological reflection, pragmatism, the concern for women's experiences, the presence of the Bible, the role of music and art, and so many things that are reflected in religion and spirituality in Latin America. So we want to thank all of you who contributed to this and now have a chance to share with those who've joined us what it is we've learned together today in our breakout groups. And so I think the method here is going to simply be to take some time to ask the rapporteur of each breakout group to share with the larger group what they came up with in terms of what were the major takeaways that came from your conversation, but also the question of spirituality. What do we mean by spirituality? And what's the role of spirituality in Latin America? As I said earlier in the group, as an historian of religions trained in the Chicago tradition, I always saw religion and spirituality as complementary, though for the last 15 years, students keep coming and telling me, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual, putting these as versus each other. But this essay was about the combination of spirituality and religion. And so why don't we now share with you what the authors in the different groups came up with. Let's start with the group that dealt with Catholicism and beyond. Let's start with Catholicism and beyond. Let's see, was that Mary Jo McConahay?
Mary Jo McConahay. Thank you, David. Thanks very much. Our group was Ryan Christopher Jones, who wrote about the pilgrimage to Guadalupe, Sacred Renewal in Mexico City. He's a photojournalist and writer. Amy Erica Smith, who wrote about water of life, religion, drought, and fire in Brazil, and Roberto Mata, Exodus testimonials, migrant Pentecostal spirituality in the US Mexico borderlands. I hope only by the enthusiasm from my voice will you understand the richness of this conversation, but I won't be able to give all the details. I sort of wish that these breakout groups had been recorded too, but anyway, maybe next time. One thing that hit me right from the beginning, even though this was called Catholicism and Beyond, was how much our conversation could have been ripped from the headlines. That is, we spoke about environment, migrants and refugees, and a bit about history and why it is important today. And I'm going to jump right into the spirituality. Well, first of all, that idea that we can look at these themes and apply them to what we see all around us and what we read in the newspapers, I felt was a very rich understanding. I'm going to jump right into the discussion on spirituality because that was, to me, the most wide-reaching, not just about spirituality, but about how one experiences the sacred. And our views on this came from the kind of work that we have been doing. Spirituality, of course, is one component of religion, but it's one that sparks vivid discussion and vivid introspection. In one way, the thought arose that spirituality is an awareness of the other. Now, whether in human terms or whether in transcendental terms could be continued discussion. It's an openness to awe. It's a knowing of the divine by way of experience. I really liked this one because it made us all reflect on the various experiences that we had. We're social scientists, academic researchers, journalists, and yet we can all speak to the depth of spirituality either in ourselves or among those that we meet. We did discuss whether spirituality was necessarily a community experience, or whether one could be deeply spiritual in and of oneself, rather than being in a community, rather than having it express itself in a community experience. I think that the most important, there wasn't a single important takeaway, but because of time, I'll just say that the imminence of these crises that we are dealing with right now, the COVID, the violence of COVID, state violence, political violence, the environmental crisis, and the crisis of refugees and migrants all relate to religion and spirituality. And for so many of us, the absolute best way to understand, let us say, religion and spirituality in the midst of these crises is to become, or to be, or to continue to be open to stories, the stories of people, the lived experience of others, whether in the midst of a migratory crisis, in the midst of violence, in the midst of environmental crisis. So with a plea for going after stories as a way of understanding these issues, I'll close. Thank you.
Oh, that's a terrific, terrific summary. Anyone else from that group like to add a comment? There's a lot there that could be developed. I thought that this idea of openness to all was interesting. I'm glad to hear that. Some of you know I complained about the word awesome today. I like the word awesome. I'm into all. It's just that people use the word awesome all the time in silly ways. My son and I went to have breakfast in Denver, and by the time the eggs had arrived, we heard 5 awesomes already by everything we said. And that kind of bothers me, because I think all and religious experience is really important. So anybody else want to add something? Roberto Mata.
Yes, I think that one of the components that came up in our discussions on spirituality was how this notion of embodied spiritualities and experiences of the sacred emerge as a kind of critique of Eurocentric models of a spirituality that kind of detach or that reduce a spirituality to dogma or church doctrine or even beliefs. So I thought that was an important intervention that needed to be highlighted.
Embodied spiritualities. Yeah.
David, I don't want to put Amy Erica on the spot, but if you, Amy, Erica, did want to raise the point about interior spirituality versus community spirituality that was raised in our group.
Yeah, I think so. The earlier in the discussion before this large group, the recorded group, got started, David had raised the really provocative question about what is spirituality. That spirituality, he posited the notion that spirituality requires a relationship with something. The question is, what is that thing that one is in relationship with in spirituality? And I would argue, I think that our collective work shows that the thing with which one is in relationship can be widely varying. It is transcendent or sacred, though none of us is comfortable defining what we mean by transcendent or sacred. But beyond transcendent or sacred, it can be a community. Spirituality can be a relationship with embodied community. It can be a relationship with one's own spirit, defined as transcendent or sacred. It can be a relationship with the ancestors, it can be a relationship with what we Westerners in 2021 would call nature, which is complicated. The concept of nature is complicated in the context of spirituality. It can, of course, be a relationship with God or gods. So yeah, I think it is a relationship, but what it is a relationship with is extraordinarily complicated to define. And maybe this just means that there are many routes, many paths to spirituality, but it also means that what you do with it, the implications for the world, the implications for politics, the implications for society are extraordinarily varied as well, depending on what you're in relationship with in terms of your spirituality.
Wow, thank you for that. I mean, your closing comment there reflects something I heard in Mary Jo's comments. There's a kind of interest in pragmatism. What do you do with this relationship, this awareness, this awesome awareness of the crisis and then the response? So I think that we're seeing a very interesting spectrum here. Anyone else from this group before we open it up to the next group and then the larger group? Thank you very much for that, Amy. Anyone else from this group?
So my apologies to the group. I had another meeting. I wasn't able to join the group, and I'm very sorry for that. I just want to echo some things that I'm hearing, though, and riff on what Professor Carrasco often invokes when he speaks about spirituality, and that is the imagination. So when we think about the transcendent, when we think about the divine, the sacred, we can also think about these things in human terms and the power of the imagination to have a kind of relationship with this thing that we're calling divine or sacred or holy. And I just don't want to lose sight of that. The power of the human imagination to enter into these types of relationships, even if we cannot definitively say what that other thing is exactly that we're in relationship to. But I just want to underscore how powerful ideals can be, how powerful the human imagination can be in setting up this kind of relationship.
Can I respond?
Sure.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I would say also that one of the themes that ran through our discussion implicitly and explicitly was the power of story, which I think relates very closely to what Chris was talking about. I mean, I think that through story and through narrative, stories which are written in holy texts, stories that we write in newspapers, through stories that we write in magazines, all of us are coming to interpret and reimagine the divine, and then use this interpretation and reimagination for our own individual and collective purposes. Roberto has this really great story. Maybe we can finish on Roberto's story of the woman at the border.
Of course. I think it was at the Nogales border checkpoint, and was actually witnessing some women using the Bible, the Exodus, citing the Exodus, and in a conversation or exchange with immigration officers, and citing the Bible, literally demanding that the immigration officers let them go through. Again, sort of the words of Moses to Pharaoh, let my people go. But in this case, let me go through, let me cross the border. Again, the power of storytelling. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's terrific. And you know, in this group here, we've got people who tell stories with their photographs, with their dances, with their music, with their silence, with their prayer. And so, you know, let's move on and build on this excellent first presentation. I wanted to jump down to something that may seem far away from Catholicism and beyond, but it's not really, and that's indigenous religions and the contact zone. Let's hear from that group. I think Juliana Cohen is the rapporteur. So Juliana.
I am. Thank you, Profe. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I was in the group of, as Prof said, Indigenous Spirituality and the Contact Zone. And the articles that were published under that section included an article on the experience of translating the Mayan Popol Vuh. Rebecca Mendoza wrote about the sacred smoke of Copal. Octavio Carrasco wrote about Maximon and rituals of resistance. Jessica Joyce Christie wrote about a quest for Maya and Aymara spirituality and identity. Fernanda wrote about híbridos and the spirits of Brazil. And Evgenia wrote about shamanic tourism and the boom of ayahuasca in the Western world. And I wrote an article about indigenous practices in the 17th century that were used by colonial women to respond or fight against spousal violence. And so we had a very rich discussion. We felt that there were points of connection between our articles. Our response to the question of what is spirituality, I don't think I can hold it all, so people can jump in later. But we did focus a lot on the notion of relationality and reciprocity, and that including both living human beings, but also the spirits. Prof. Carrasco said at the beginning of the meeting that one of the ways in which people are spiritual is by being in communion with the spiritual world, and that can exist in the form of ancestors or the natural world or just gods that we feel like we connect to. We also talked about how these relationships and exchanges do lead to transformation. That is a component of our shared understanding of spirituality. You are not left the same person after you have an experience that you can call spiritual. But we also, since our group was dealing with indigenous issues and the cosmovision of non-Judeo-Christian traditions is very different from ours, or slightly different from ours, we did talk about the notion of spirituality not being a concept in certain indigenous traditions, or in many of them, and how this divide between the secular and the religious world comes from our westernized way of understanding the world. And so that led us to a conversation about epistemology, which means the ways in which we know the world. And since Evgenia's article and Rebecca's article deal with the commodification of indigenous sacred traditions, we also talked about what it means to sort of buy these experiences. Can we really commodify a spirit? Can we really commodify the transformative process that happens once you've had a religious experience? I don't think we had a finite answer to that question. I think we had more questions after we posed that question, but that was something rich that came out of our conversation. We also talked about, Octavio raised the point that spirituality, or these exchanges with spirits, are also about extending relationships with non-human beings. As I said, Prof. Carrasco mentioned that it's being in relationship with the spirit, but what I took out from Octavio's comment is more like expanding our own universe and being able to understand that we can be in relationship with something that we don't understand or we don't have like a name for. We also talked about the challenges in the study of religion. What does it mean to study indigenous traditions in an academic space that has been built upon the tradition of studying religion through the Judeo-Christian lens? Mm-hmm. And we came to sort of the conclusion that at the end of the day, we're talking about technologies. We're talking about, I think it was Michel Foucault who used this term, technologies of the self. These constant searches that we have for a better understanding of ourselves, of the world, of being in communion with human and non-human beings, we seek those through these technologies that we understand as spiritual practices. And at the end, the process can be transformation. There's a lot. We also talked about the commonalities in our pieces, in all of our pieces, and Evgenia gave a very brilliant summary. We all thought that she summarized it really well by using 4 words. All of our pieces talk about the devastation that came with colonization and colonialism, and the violence that was exercised on indigenous communities through that process. But as Octavio wrote in his marvelous article, there cannot be a conversation about colonialism and conquest without there being a conversation about resilience and resistance. And I would add endurance to that mix. And then there's also transformation in that process. And at the end of this transformative process, there is hybridity, and something new is born from this long history of worldviews colliding. And at the end of the day, it's humans trying to make meaning of our world. I am going to leave it at that because I feel like there's too much, and I'm going to give the opportunity to my group members to share whatever I missed. So thank you for listening to me.
Excellent, excellent. That reminds me, while others may want to speak up now, that Charles Long, my teacher at Chicago, talked about colonialism. And one of the things he said that what we have to do now is to discover and identify the resources that came out of this tragic encounter and make those resources available for more people so that we can enlarge the presence of the human in history. You know, you don't deny the tragedy, but you realize there were resources that were created there that weren't there before. And you garner those resources in order to enlarge the presence of the human in history. So that came to me from listening to Juliana. Anyone else in that group would like to add to this notion of transformation?
I could say one thing. I apologize. We've had very difficult time with the connection here. There's a lot of wind and the volcanoes blowing up. My name is Vincent Stanzio. Nice to be with you all. There's 2 things I heard. One is stories. And since I'm translating the Popol Vuh, a lot of ideas have come up with the idea of story and how important story is and how important mythology is, and what we lose when we don't have a mythology and we're not allowed to have a mythology. And particularly here in Guatemala, you have a country that has the national book being the Popol Vuh, but also denying that you're going to use that book to create an identity of a country and also to empower people through this very empowering story, very important empowering myth. And so there's so much transformation that goes on through a myth, and how useful and how wonderful it would be if Mesoamerica and the people who come from Mesoamerica would be able to have this myth in a way that's, in a sense, something that they understand, that the people would understand through a language that is their language. So I think about it a lot. I think about the possibilities, the tremendous possibilities that come through a story like the Popol Vuh, and what it would mean for people to be able to love their story and to be able to use their story and to be able to entregarse a la historia, in the sense of really giving yourself to a story and being able to have a lot of to embody the story and to be able to speak that language of that story. It's just so important. And yet this is what has been decapitated from the consciousness of Central America in particular, and Guatemala in particular, and the highlands of Guatemala, where you're not allowed to look at the Popol Vuh because you're a Christian, and you're not allowed to look at the Popol Vuh because you're a modern person and you're studying the sciences, or you're becoming a doctor or a lawyer. You're an indigenous person and you don't want to look back and you don't want to look at those things that you once were. So how do we make these stories available for people. That's what I wonder, if this is ever going to be a possibility.
Thank you very much, Vintley Stanzioni. I saw you earlier, you disappeared. It's good to hear from you again. Stanzioni is doing a new translation of the Popol Vuh, and we're working with him. And if you read his article, that's his kind of statement of manifesto and purpose. He used the word decapitated. It seems to me this reflects very well with what Juliana was talking about, that she got from Evgenia, and that is this notion of devastation and violence that's so important there. Anyone else from this group?
If no one else wants to speak, I'd like to add something.
Can I say
that
something?
came up.
Yeah, Jessica.
Okay. Yeah, I'm wondering increasingly about the seeming disconnect between our conversations and the real Maya or Aymara people that I encounter when I'm in these places. Now, I realize there's Maya intellectuals that, you know, very much have similar conversations, speak about the Popol Vuh, but the lives of the people I interview, I try to meet, I try to make human connections with on the street. I mean, their lives are severely impacted by the economic inequalities. I mean, yes, they are spiritual. They build new wakas in Copacabana. They go to Catholic churches, they make offerings just to maximize their chances that they get some kind of economic benefit or healing benefit for survival. And usually academics don't really want to talk about that. Or we were talking in another session for SAA about that. You know, you probably know when you're in the field and interact with people, I mean, there's always people who are asking you for money to help, paying medical bills, people who really don't have enough food. And I mean, now with COVID, especially in Peru and in some of the Maya villages, it's even that much worse, but that's never taken into consideration on an academic level or on a funding level. Universities don't give extra support for that, or funding agencies. I mean, these are not items academics can write in grant proposals, but that still leaves this tremendous inequality. And it seems like ever more, it feels to me like this disconnect between the elevated conversations we have here and what people right now feel, many people, you know, on Semana Santa in many of the villages. That I don't know how to solve it, but it's part of reality and it should figure in somehow.
Well, you've helped us figure it in, and thank you for that, Jessica. You've come to the right place because, in fact, in this particular group, there's a number of students and people who are doing what you're asking for. And that is, there are parts of the university that are very involved in these types of struggles, not enough, but in fact, people in the divinity school, some of the people here are very much involved in this kind of not only critique, but looking to try to raise resources. Universities themselves are not very well organized in order to do what you're asking, and that should be done, which is not only a critique, but a transformation of the tremendous unequal distribution of goods that have been so much a part of Latin American history and its relationship, not only with its own oligarchs, but with the United States, with the CIA, with Spain, and so forth and so on. This is a very important question. And maybe it'll come out a little bit more in some of the other presentations. So your cry is in effect something that we can never hear enough of. And I think that we can only thank you for this. I think what Stanzioni was saying was that he was trying to say that by raising up the question of the stories themselves, that also energizes some of the people who have suffered these kinds of things, which I think we're going to hear more about now when we go to the group that is focusing on African and Latin religions. I was in this group, and I'd like to hear from them if they could now make a presentation, keeping in mind Jessica's very powerful question, which we'll come back to in a few minutes.
Hello.
You're muted, Jessica.
Thank you very much. And it's very good to hear that Harvard is listening. My university does not understand or does not want to understand those issues.
Well, I'm not saying Harvard is listening. I'm saying some people at Harvard, a minority. In fact, we've got some good ones here also at DePaul and other places. We're listening, but we have to have bigger ears. So let's hear from the Latin and African group.
Hello, everybody. My name is Adrian. I had the pleasure of leading the discussion for the AfroLatinx Religion and Spirituality group, which includes Nadia Issa's Body as Layered Divinity, Abby Rayhart's Ashe and Capoeira. I think Isaac is adding the links in the chat, so you can access them kind of fairly quickly there, and a couple of others. We covered a lot of ground, as many of the groups have already said. So a couple of the things that we thought were important to share, and I want to be relatively brief to then open it up to Nadia and to Abby, is that Afro-Latin religion and spirituality is a body-intensive practice. That means that the teaching not only happens by initiation and by a kind of doing, learning process, but also usually requires a critical ethnographic approach. So whether that's participant observation, whether that's other forms of kind of bodily engaged forms of study, that those tend to be the ones that really address the form and the process of the traditions themselves. The second thing that we thought was useful in highlighting was that motives for being interested in these traditions can vary. So folks can go to capoeira just because they want to stay fit, or they can go to different traditions because they want to receive comfort in the face of grief, which I think some of us touch upon. And yet the ritual spaces of these particular traditions are dynamic and powerful enough to hold all of those motives in the ritual space. And so we thought that was an important thing to highlight. In terms of the direct question of spirituality, it seemed like we actually approached that question as a translation issue. So the way that we translated that question into our context was to talk about Ashe. And Ashe as really the way that we can think about something like relationships to others, whether those are divine or other types of others, that really move beyond the institutional and really kind of leave their imprint in aesthetics, in choreography, in dance, in music, which is so infused in Latin American and the Caribbean by Afro-Latin American religions. So with that, I will open up to Nadia and Abby if they want to add anything else to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Adrian, and it's such an honor to be here. Earlier, kind of contemplating, meditating on, this almost binary or the polarization of spirituality and religion. I always saw them as coexisting, interwoven, intermingling. Personally, I always hyphenate spirituality and religion. So I always use spiritual religious or spiritual religions. And in my context of being a scholar practitioner in the Afro-Cuban tradition, Regla de Ochaifa or Lucumí or Santeria Cubana, I have almost a unique stance. So religion kind of has always been posited as this practice of religion or spirituality that happens in the institutional, right? It's given an institutional space. It's officialized in a certain way, in which most non-Abrahamic traditions do not, right? We practice in our basements, we practice in our living rooms. Quickly, our bedrooms turn into ceremonial spaces. And so my elders, right, and ethnography, along with dance performance and dance composition, is my method of research and connecting with folks, is that my elders use religión as much as they use espiritualidad. Religión, and this talks about that piece of translation missing in translation, is that religión is talking about a practice, and then that espiritualidad or spirituality is that everyday praxis and commitment, right? That the religion that I come from, that African diasporic traditions, it's not consolidated to a Sunday, right? It's every day. It's how you hold your body, it's how you speak, it's how you walk down the stairs, it's how you wake up, it's how you put your feet on the ground. It really is this lifestyle, right? And I think that entry point of Ache or Ashe in Candomblé is that we talked about how Ashe is both this energy of both individual and community clashing, coinciding all the time intimately, right? And it's also materialized. So when you think about Ache, you're thinking about someone's ability, someone's talent, someone's Ache is like, wow, they have this gift, right? This divine gift to be able to be a medium, to be able to read, to be able to feel these numinous experiences that feel imaginative, but that they're very real, right? Like they're very much grounded. And so when you think about Ache in ceremonial spaces, there's several different motivations for folks to come into that space. And I think about the space in Relado Chaifa called a tambor or a wemilere. And basically it's the coming together of the dance, the drumming, and the chanting. That's a call of response. And they all have to be there. And there's a way in which the institution is already probably weary of the arts, right? Or theological studies along with artistic studies, and implicating the arts as prayer, as these experiences, that they cannot be separated, right? That it's a very internal experience, right? Everyone goes there for an agenda. The motivation for the tambor can be that it's someone's religious birthday, right? Because this is an initiation-based tradition, but everyone could go there for their own motivation, right? And I think about Ache is very much situated there because there's consecrated drums, there's orichas, deities consecrated in there, and there are priestesses everywhere. And I also talk about the time I take, when I used to take in my fieldwork in 2017 and 18, when I took different Afro-Cuban folklore at the Arts University in Havana, and the way that without being in a ceremonial space, without the consecrated drums present, Oricha was still called on, and folks were able to be mounted, right? I don't use possessed, I don't use trance, but when folks are mounted, it's still, the Ache is still there, right? That it's this tangible energy that doesn't need the formalized ceremonial space, but that these rhythms still being played and the agency of the Oricha to want to come down is still very much present. And I think it's just very deep. And I think that what brings me so easily into ethnography is that as a dance practitioner, performer, doing the thing, observing the thing, repeating the thing is what makes me understand the depth of concepts or realities such as Ache and these experiences that, you know, you wouldn't have if you're just not speaking to the people living these realities, right? Like they're the true theorists, the people that I'm interviewing. It's not about me. It's about how they're conceptualizing and how they're living this spiritual religious life.
I'd really like to tag on to what Nadia was saying in talking about rhythm and sounds and movement in these spaces. As an ethnomusicologist, I'm very very focused on the role of music and why is it present in these spaces. But through a different context, I was primarily looking at a capoeira academy here in Florida, taught by non-Brazilians, two non-Brazilians, but still seeing these spiritual practices rooted in Yoruba rituals and candomblé and samba and santeria. Sorry, I will try to speak up. Still being practiced and cultivated in every rehearsal, in every training period, in every hoda. And having music as this conduit for these altered states of mind. Having these repetitive groove rhythms and these participatory aspects of the music where everyone in that space, in that ritual space, is either singing in Portuguese, sometimes invoking God or other orishas, despite not being practitioners of candomblé, of playing these instruments, all helping with these altered states of mind that allow for a different way of being for many of the capoeiristas I was talking to, of literally seeing the world upside down, because often you're actually on your hands looking at, from a different perspective completely and interacting with another body in this space and losing oneself in those moments and connecting with another through physical dialogue of that embodied knowledge, and through the music of another, of a language of another. That the capoeiristas I interviewed were very much connecting to those practices of talking about Ashe and how we pile it on during these ritual spaces, through music, through attentiveness, like being present in that moment. That although they might not talk about it in terms of it being a religion or even, you know, spirituality per se, they are still practicing it with their bodies, with their participation. That is a different sort of knowledge system that doesn't get recognized a lot. But finding a lot of value in that of participating in this potentiality that Nadia was talking about of Ashe, of our power to reach across, to try and be in dialogue with another.
Okay, thank you very much for that. This idea of, it's interesting, Nadia talks about mounting and you talk about piling it on, which is, you know, what happens in these powerful experiences. You feel like it's being piled on. But also your notion of the alternative way of seeing the world. Before we move to our colleagues on Judaism, you know, I had this teacher at Chicago. His name was Victor Nazario. He was a Puerto Rican radical priest. He was part of that whole liberation theology movement with Francisco Juliao and Paulo Freire and Ivan Illich. And I was a young graduate student there, and I was, you know, full of ideals and so forth. And he used to always tell me, you know, David, it's the opposite of what you think. And I would say, the opposite? He said, yeah, it's the opposite of what you think. I said, you mean it can't be 45 degrees off? No, it's 180 degrees from what you think. This really bothered me. So I remember once we went to the barrio, I was introducing him to some gang members that I worked with. And I said, look, how shall I introduce you? And he said, well, how about if I do it this way? And he said, okay. So I went in and I introduced him and he said, you know, it's just the opposite of what this guy just said. He's got it all wrong. So it kind of hurt my feelings. The next time we went down there, I said, okay, I'm going to introduce you this way. Is that okay? Different. He said, yeah, that's fine. I went in and introduced him. He stood up in front of all these gang members and said, don't listen to this guy. It's the opposite of what this guy just said. And it was kind of, I was like, I'd go back, my ego would be crushed. And then it came to me. He was trying to get into my mind and to get me to think more deeply about these things that came out of my mouth. So I think that sometimes this kind of dancing and music is about telling you it's the opposite of what you've been living. This is what is real, this kind of relationship with Ashe. So since time is moving on and we're going to have a chance for everybody, I wanted to turn to Judaism in Latin America. I had a chance to sit in on that wonderful conversation. So Dalia, to start us off with this very important part, often neglected part of Latin America in the history of it.
Thank you, Professor Carrasco, and thank you also to June Ehrlich for this invitation. It's been such a pleasure to have a chance to participate in this issue. In our group, we include articles from Ronnie Perales on the Sephardic connection to the prehistory of Latin American Jewish America. We have Ruth Behar, My Ancestors' Keys, as she speaks about her family's coming to Cuba and then what that means when she herself immigrated as a young child to the United States. We have Ilan Stavans, we have who speaks of different spiritual trends in Latin America, what it meant for him to engage in that same journey to discover. We have Marjorie Agosín, growing up Jewish in Chile, and she speaks of Chile and really focuses on the landscape and its intersection with memory and what that meant for her family to find refuge in Chile. And then we have Rachelle Grossman, who speaks of Mexican Yiddish and the intersection with Mexican nationalist art movements after the revolution. And my own piece also focuses on Mexico and how current generations are integrating spiritual and institutional Judaism in their communities. So that's a bit of an overview of this section. And in our conversation leading up to the webinar, we talked about a few themes that came up that really strung the articles together. One has to do with this idea that the Jews have their own connection to Iberian history and the Sephardic diaspora, which were Jews that were living in Spain before the expulsion in 1492. That story is connected also to the existence of converso Jews all over the Iberian world, but also in the Americas. And that leading to how the idea of Jews and the existence of indigenous people kind of merge together as we think of contact, conquest, discovery, and then the negotiations that ensue for centuries. We also talk about how Latin America in modern times becomes a refuge for Jews from different Jewish diasporas, from the Sephardic modern world, meaning those Jews that did immigrate from Spain to other places in the 15th century, Jews that come from Arab lands, and also Jews that are Ashkenazi or that come from Eastern Europe originally. And they came in the 19th and 20th centuries to form modern Jewish communities, and in doing so, they find a refuge in a part of the Americas that did accept them when the northern parts might not have and might have been the preferred place of immigration. But what happens is the creation we found of Latin American Jeweries in different countries that create very deep connections to their countries that adopt them. And it becomes kind of a spiritual meshing of they're accepted as Jews and their Jewish identities continue. They have Jewish institutions that they create in these new lands, but they also develop a spiritual connection to the land itself, to the people, to engaging with a past, an Iberian past that some part of the Jewish people at one point did intersect with. So all of these ideas of Latin America being another space of Jewish diaspora and a space where Jews form part of other conversations that are indigenous to Latin America, and they're intersecting them. And we spoke, Professor Carrasco urged us to think about spiritualism and the communities that form part of certain spiritualist traditions. Who are the people involved? Who are your ancestors? What might the landscape? We added the food. These are the ways that Jews talk about all of these elements in Latin America and their new homes, I think, are part of that spirituality that in particular Ruth Behar and I were speaking of. So I think that this is a nice an introduction. I see Ruth Behar and Marjorie Agosín are on with us as well as representatives of our groups if they wanted to jump in.
Dalia. Can you hear me? No.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, yes.
I'm very sorry, but I think I'm suffer from Zoom exhaustion. I thought that our group, everything began at 1. So forgive me for not being in the group. So I wanted to just begin by thanking June Ehrlich for inviting me. And she is a wonderful editor, and poets need editor. And it's a pleasure to meet you, Professor Carrasco, and just to be with all of you. I just want, after hearing this very insightful conversation, I wanted to, what I've learned from the article I wrote is that I've always heard as a child that we are not like everybody else, that we're different, that we celebrate different holidays, that we act differently, that we don't quite belong. And all what I wanted was to belong. But I couldn't quite belong in Chile because I was a minority, and really all minorities have trouble belonging. But I wanted to say that I wanted to belong to the Spanish language. And you said that's something very important, Dalia, that we all have somehow hold on to a Sephardic past, whether you are Ashkenazi or Sephardi or even Mizrahi. And what I found out in the experience of Chile and Judaism in Latin America, we are perhaps 1% of the entire population. And a lot of people do not know much about us because we tend to kind of live separate lives, go to separate schools. But I wanted to share the idea that we also don't know about them, that it works both ways. And in my story, and I've never said this in public, so I thank June for encouraging me, I told the story that my sister and I were baptized. And that was an amazing story, especially because of my parents' reaction, that they believed that a bit of holy water will not hurt us. So what I wanted to share with you and speak about from the point of view of writing the story, that we could have dualities. We could be Jewish, we can understand Catholicism now, evangelism, and that there's a time where the Jew should not feel so different. And even though people always say there's so much anti-Semitism in Chile, yes, there is, but so is the world, and Hungary and Poland, and so is Charlottesville, and so is Donald Trump. It's here. So I wanted to speak from the perspective of abundance. I am grateful to Chile because they allowed my family to find refuge and to find shelter. So thank you.
If there's time, I'll also jump in. Is the sound okay? Everything's working? Okay,
Yes.
great. Yeah, so thank you so much, Dalia, for summing things up so beautifully, and Marjorie for your beautiful statement now as well. And it's also for me such a pleasure and honor to be here. And so I wrote about Cuba, and I was connecting a lot with Nadia because I'm also very familiar with Regla de Ocha, And so in my case, I'm writing as a Cuban Jew, but also as a cultural anthropologist who goes back and forth to Cuba. And I use the symbol of the keys, of my ancestors' keys, again, invoking that Sephardic past, which in my case is part of my own history. I'm Sephardic on my father's side and Ashkenazi on my mother's side. But the idea of the key is something that remains as legend in the Sephardic community, that the Sephardic Jews took the keys to their houses with them when they were expelled in 1492. And so I wanted to invoke that idea of the keys, but also connect it to more contemporary 20th and 21st century history, and really address this theme of loss and the trauma of loss, the trauma of departure, and also the energy of returning as well. And I was really glad now to hear the Exodus story mentioned by Roberto Mata earlier, and thinking of Exodus. Of course, this is the week of Passover right now, so Jewish people have this very much on their minds, and what Exodus and departure means. And as Dalia said, for so many of us, Jewish Latinas and Latinos, Latin America was a refuge for our communities. In the case of my family, my maternal family, that was the Ashkenazi, Polish, Russian side, all of the family that stayed behind in Europe perished in the Holocaust, but the ones that went to Cuba survived. And so, that was very important. I associate Cuba with life, with vida, with ache, literally, because Cuba gave life to my family and essentially allowed me eventually to be born as well. And I always say I'm Jewish because I'm Cuban. I always connect these two identities very, very closely. And so the theme of loss and return is, I think, very important in the way I think about spirituality in Cuba. And what I tried to address in my piece is the two communities that exist, the two Jewish communities that exist in Cuba. There's the community that existed before '59, before the revolution in Cuba. And that was the community that my family was a part of at a time when there were 15,000 Jews in Cuba who thought they were going to be staying in Cuba forever. And I discussed the Patronato, which is the Jewish Community Center, which is in a very central part of Havana, right off of Linea. And the community builds this community center in the 1950s, thinking they're going to stay in Cuba forever, that they're going to this is going to be their permanent home. And then a few years later, they all end up departing after the revolution, when they decide they don't want to be part of a socialist system. And so they create this presence in the landscape of Cuba, in the landscape of Havana, and then they have to leave it all behind and start again in the United States. But then people like me, I left as a child. I was 4.5 years old, but I always heard about Cuba and eventually was able to go back and do my research there. And now I go back to that synagogue, the Patronato, which has become a kind of pilgrimage site that people traveling to Cuba who want to find the Jews, they go to that particular synagogue searching for what's left, the traces of the Jewish presence. And there's another level of kind of emotional connection for me, because we lived half a block away from that synagogue, from the Patronato, and we could see it every day as we walked around the neighborhood. So every time I go back, I go to that space again, and I re-inhabit, in a sense, a space of loss and try to recover it again as part of my own spirituality. But that is also connected to getting to know the new Jewish community that exists in Cuba, which is a very interesting one, because religion was largely suppressed in Cuba in the 60s and 70s and 80s, but people maintained spirituality and interiority of faith. And we see that in many different religious communities on the island, and we see it in the Jewish community. They had enough left of the spirituality that then in the 90s, when essentially, as I put it in the article, the Cuban government allowed God back into the island, they were able to reconnect with the religious part of their heritage. And many American Jews have been going to Cuba and helping the community to revitalize. So I wanted to address all of those different elements, both the personal and the ethnographic elements, and how they all come together in the way I represent Cuba. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's a very powerful threesome right there. And something that Marjorie Agosín said stands out to me when she talked about this question of belonging. This question of belonging, who belongs, who doesn't belong, also who shares, which is what Jessica Joyce Christie was asking, who shares? What do we share? What do we don't share? You know, as we try to belong. And I think that, you know, religion and spirituality is very much about belonging. And, you know, who's in your community? Rebecca Mendoza wrote that when you talk about your community, it's not only the ancestors, it's also the land. It's also plants. It's also, you know, the animals themselves, who's in your community. And the different religions, I think, emphasize this differently. So I think those are important. Let me just ask you, June, is this a time to open this up to other people?
Yes, I think it is perfect time to open up to other people. Panelists can ask questions of each other by raising their hands. And there is a question already there. And the other questions are going to be down, David, in the Q&A, which is on the furthest right-hand side. Panelists cannot use the Q&A. You either can raise your hand or put it in the chat. Okay, for now, Patricia Smith of Tufts University asked Vincent, is Popol Vuh not known by the indigenous population of Guatemala?
Yeah, and this is a very interesting question. And no, the indigenous people of Guatemala do not know the Popol Vuh, and there's certain reasons for that. One, it's a Quiche Maya text, so the Mayas are very competitive with one another as tribes, I would say, language groups, and so they don't acknowledge one another at that level. And there must have, you know, there's tremendous involvement with the Quiches and the Cachiqueles, their animosity towards one another that comes out of the conquest because of the different alliances of the conquest. And so those things live on in Guatemala. They live on in Guatemala. And so not everybody who's speaking Cachiquel really wants to acknowledge this great Quiche text of the Popol Vuh. The other thing is that's in the 1980s, when 1971, the Popol Vuh comes out as the national book, El Libro Nacional de Guatemala. And so there are study groups. There's study groups up in the Quiche, even study groups created by people like Robert Carmack. And he's trying to understand people's relationship with the Popol Vuh and the Quiche. Well, all the people that he works with they're all killed in 1980. If you studied the Popol Vuh in the 80s, you were sought out and you were killed. So there's a lot of violence that goes with the Popol Vuh. The history of it it's wrapped up in this idea of this is indigenous power, and we cannot allow this to grow in this country. And so that's a level of it. The other thing is they're always made, it's like mythology. So this must be children's material. And of course it isn't. It's mythology, and mythology is very complicated. It's very complex, and there's a lot of poetics involved with it. So it's very hard to understand. To understand the Popol Vuh, you really need a guide. It's a book of counsel, and it needs people to counsel you through it. It's a book of initiation. So, it really needs a person there to be beside the text and kind of taking a person through it. So, it's amazing if you think that this is a text that is so perfect and it's so complete, going from cosmogony to dynasty, and it has all the hero, mythology in it. it's a real sad situation that a people cannot use their sacred book to create themselves around an identity, and being able to talk in the relationship with the Jewish diaspora, and imagine not having the Torah. Imagine not being able to use the Torah, that having the Torah being said that this is demonic and all these things, you can't use this. It's kind of, to put that into comparison, it's very powerful not to be able to acknowledge such a sacred and powerful text and beautiful poetry on top of it. So anyway, I think that's enough on that.
That's very good, very good.
Mary Jo McConahay has a question for you, David.
Yeah, David, and anyone else, of course, but in a discussion on such a wide-ranging discussion on religion in Latin America, isn't it astounding that liberation theology doesn't figure as a vigorous theme at all, or as far as I could see, even mentioned, although it is mentioned in a couple of the magazine pieces, but it's not a theme. What happened to cause this?
Yeah, I wish Christitas had stayed, because I passed her question on to him. I don't know if Mata wants to talk about this, what happened to liberation theology. Well, on one hand, it was suppressed by the papacy. I mean, Rome went after it very big time. Went after some of the leading spokesmen of liberation theology. Also, some of the practitioners were also killed, reflecting what Stanzioni was said. But at the same time, there is a movement now. I think especially there was some hope under this Pope that there would be more breathing room for liberation theology. And I think in this country, there is a sense in which it's making a comeback, but in a wider way. For instance, Roberto Mata's work, well, Roberto, say something about it.
Yes, I would agree with you in terms of your sort of historical analysis. The silencing of key figures, Leonardo and Clodovis Boff and others, whose work seem somewhat out of place for the magisterium. I would also say, though, that part of the critique is that liberation theology, even though focused primarily on this work with the poor and the preferential option for the poor, that it was also a kind of academic movement of sorts. And its development and its legacy in intellectual circles lives on through liberation hermeneutics in biblical studies, for instance. And these liberation hermeneutics have been instrumental in decentering and critiquing sort of Eurocentric paradigms for biblical interpretation. In my own work, in contextual biblical studies, I think that the question liberation and social justice as a premise for doing one's work is definitely indebted to liberation theology. So we can see that maybe it hasn't disappeared, it has morphed, right? And so we can find traces of it informing our very work, at least mine in the work of many Latinx biblical scholars who are looking at how do we read the Bible from the perspective of the people? How do we engage in this decolonial exercise and looking at the lives and experiences of the people, but also the political situations and how the Bible can be then seen as an instrument of liberation. And that can be traced back, I think, to liberation theology. So it's there, but maybe not the ways that we are accustomed to see.
It's a very good comment, and it gets back in a sense to Jessica's concern. You have places like the Harvard Divinity School, which is very, very, very cool on liberation theology, when in fact it should be a leader. In a sense, trying to mirror, it seems to me, certain authoritarian positions, even while saying they don't. So thank you for that, Roberto. Anyone else have a question?
Yeah, we have a question from Andres Hernández. What happens in those cases where religious ideologies become a means of cohesiveness as strong as the laws we know on this side of the world, as in the case of certain Abrahamic religions that base their justice systems on religious customs?
Okay, so give me the first part of that question again.
What happens in those cases where religious ideologies become a means of cohesiveness as strong as the laws we know on this side of the world?
Mata, you want to talk about that? I don't know
what happens. Well, it really depends on the context or situations in which this cohesiveness takes place. When we look at the power and impact of story, what Michael D. Jackson, Harvard anthropologist, refers to as the politics of storytelling. What happens is, one of the things I've seen, at least on the ground and through my research at the border with migrant caravans, is the ways in which stories are deployed in ways that bring to relief sort of divine intervention and an affirmation that the world is much imbued with the sacred, that communities can turn to the sacred in times of pain, social, political, geographical dislocation, to deal with the trauma and the tension and dilemma of leaving a home, but also having to an extent vilify that home in order to justify the migration, even as they hope that perhaps someday, if the circumstances are okay, they might come back. So what happens then is we see then spirituality emerging as a kind of life-giving dynamic that empowers the migrant to move on, but that also shapes their understanding of the divine as a migrant deity, as a deity that accompanies the migrant in the journey. So we're talking here about migrant mobile spiritualities, if you will.
Okay, there's also a question from Sylvia Martinez, who asked Juliana Cohen and her group, what are your thoughts on the trend of the use of indigenous practices such as yahe and ayahuasca and others by Western society?
We had a discussion about that, and I think the right person to respond to this question is Evgenia, and Rebecca, and I'd be happy to add, is she still here? I'd be happy to add anything at the end.
So my contribution to this issue was on ayahuasca tourism or shamanic tourism. And I lay out in the article some of my thoughts on ethical issues around that and how can Westerners better engage or be more aware what they're walking into. And I think the bigger issue is this intercultural contact happens in an unequal way, right? There are, as Jessica, I think what it was Jessica Christie who emphasized the tremendous inequalities, right? That the indigenous peoples of the Amazon, right, face. So I emphasize this when I talk about this, that we are walking into this exchange having privilege, and this is not necessarily, this is happening there is a power difference there, right? I also emphasize, so in my article, I try to take, to see the good and the bad, right? There is no, I talk about how tourism is not inherently a bad thing, right? There are examples where it is empowering to indigenous peoples, and actually all this interest from the West has created a sense of pride in a lot of the groups who were for centuries, persecuted for practicing these technologies, as we called them. But I really like the word. On the other hand, though, we need to be aware that there's still inequalities. And I ask, what are the best ways for Indigenous peoples to engage in this on their own terms, right? That I think that would be the best way. But that we also talked about in my group a recent trend that's kind of concerning, right? Meaning that these technologies are often used not in the same way that they were used or are still used by local communities. Often today they're used to enhance productivity or to further more capitalist goals. This is still a lot to, I don't know, I'm still researching this aspect of this. But what I emphasized in our group discussion was that when Westerners engage with one of these technologies, what happens is that we get to the tip of the iceberg, and there's a whole worldview. Maybe we take a tool or a technology, but then there's a whole worldview or a way of knowing the world underneath that we don't necessarily get to, right? And that takes lifelong engagement and work that not all of us are willing to do. So for that, to close, the article I think lays it out in much more detail. There is potential for transformation, for societal transformation, but there are a lot of issues that can get in the way that we need to be aware of.
Jessica Joyce had posed a question, which I find very interesting. Do you just want me to read it, Jessica?
Hold on a second, just a second. Rebecca, did you want to respond to something in that?
If we have a moment, I will jump.
Go ahead.
Yes, I'll keep it brief. Essentially, I think to respond to this question and kind of join in Eugenia's response, thinking about, so my piece about copal, while it's not necessarily thought of in the same category as ayahuasca or peyote, it's thinking about plants as teachers and kind of the relational aspect of being enmeshed in the cosmos, right? And so thinking of kind of from an indigenous perspective around even trees. And I owe a lot of this to Profe Carrasco and Juliana, who have given me a lot to think about in terms of copal, but really thinking about our relatedness in terms of the way that we are showing up to plants as either medicine or teacher or product and commodity, right? And so in kind of bringing what we would call Western or kind of neoliberal approach to these plants, we may or may not be able to commodify it in a spiritual sense, but we will do harm to the trees that give us, as I write in the article, their blood in copal, which then is part of the offering and spiritual engagement with the gods and with the rest of the cosmos. So just thinking about kind of that complexity of relationality in terms of it's not just a plant that is out of context, you could say.
Mm-hmm.
I also wanted to add on this conversation and also what was said before that a lot of what we talked about was knowledge or wisdom that's not immediately accessible to like intellectual or Western framework. You can view something as infinitely exploitable, but that doesn't mean you're not missing the real point. And the human spirit and the relationship with the earth and these substances, plants, and energies, goes beyond our effort to define or put them into small categories. Just because we don't see it doesn't mean it's not there.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd say something. I think that's an interesting situation. Yeah. Well, I think it was really interesting, this idea of the copal. Should I buy the copal? Should I not buy the copal online? And it's a big question. I mean, you can ruin all these trees. And it would drive the price up for copal here with the indigenous people, which the real copal that you buy in the marketplace is quite expensive now. And by the way, Rebecca, this would be a great country for you to come burn a lot of copal if that's what you wanted to do. because that's what people do. They burn tremendous amounts of copal, and that's so important for them still. This is extremely important in the religion, that this copal, that this essence that maybe we don't understand, that it exists, and it exists in that scent, that smell, that scent that creates that relationship with the divinity, with the Nahuales, that if it's not there, well, you're not going to have the connection. Yeah, and so this copal, it's not just a small thing, it's in this context of that religion and that way that it's used. And I think this is the same way with talking about the ayahuasca. When you take it out of the context of what the ayahuasca is, and people just coming in to use it because they're using it for their needs, well, I think that there's a big problem there for those people in particular, but maybe even for the people who are in the Amazon, giving the ayahuasca, their relationship with the ayahuasca then becomes somehow transformed in probably not very positive ways. So this is a big, I think it's a big deal. You see this a lot in Guatemala, people bringing in ayahuasca, and then this really strange relationship with the ayahuasca, and also with the indigenous people here, wondering what they're doing. Where does that come from? Who are these people? And, maybe why don't we have this? Or wouldn't this be good for us? We could be giving people ayahuasca and making a lot of money. So it's driven people in indigenous cultures, and it's asking the question, why can't we, aprovechar and say de algo así? So it's very interesting, and these are real issues that I think that are happening all the time with the practice and the performance. Someone else earlier on was talking, I think it was Abby, talking about performance, and then also is it Nadia? Talking about the performance, and this performance is so important. This is just so important, that a performance of ritual, and what you can't understand about it unless you're performing it, then there's all this other level of knowledge and understanding in life, which is obviously not academic, it's not coined this way, but it is knowledge. And I think that this is it's great to see people that are working in this area, very important, performance.
Okay, thank you very much. June?
Yeah, I want to thank you for having been our moderator. I want to thank each and every one of you from the bottom of my heart for your articles, for your participation, and for being part of the ReVista community. Thank you to the public, which has been attending this, and we hope to see you again at another ReVista launch.
Thank you, June. Thank you, everybody, and have a great Passover, Holy Week.